Back in 2014, the Toyota Corolla wasn't just Australia's best-selling small car, it was the top seller out of all vehicle categories. By 2024, it had been knocked back to 7th among Australia's top 10 bestsellers, with the 6 above it all being utes and SUVs. The next non-SUV or ute in the top sellers list was the Kia Cerato, down at 19th. So, why are we supersizing our cars? I'm Mike Bartlett. Welcome to RSE's Horizons podcast. To pull apart this new trend for larger vehicles, I'm joined by Associate Professor Paul Roberts, Deputy Director of the WA Centre for Road Safety Research. We'll be talking about the increasing popularity of large cars on our roads, some of the factors driving this trend, and the broader impacts on health, safety, and the environment. Paul, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So as we just said, in 2014, the Toyota Corolla was top of the heap when it came to car sales. It's now been knocked down to 7th place. Why are we seeing this trend? Why are we starting to supersize our cars? What's your take?
Well, there's been a lot of commentary about this. I think there are a variety of factors. Certainly, I think when the SUV, well, we could probably go back even further, really. We could go back to sort of what was called MPVs, multi-purpose vehicles. I think maybe Renault was the sort of inventor of the MPV, although I think there might be some debate about that. But the idea that you could take a sort of standard sort of, or maybe a small car and just blow it up a bit, use the same platform, but make it a little bit taller, give it a bit more space, and maybe a bit more length, and just create some additional practicality. That sort of appealed to families. SUVs kind of added, I guess, the idea that you've got that off-road capability as well. So it's like that idea, it's the practicality plus adding some, ruggedness and off-road capability. So I think it was a good idea, or in the public, for public perception, it was a good idea. But I guess your question's really about why do they keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger?
Well, that is interesting because I know that the average car has grown in size. A typical family car from the 80s, like the Holden's Commodore, was about 1,722 millimetres wide. That's not very about, it's very precise, isn't it? That's narrower now than a modern Volkswagen Golf, which is thought of as being a very small car. So even cars classed as small are much larger than they were 20 to 30 years ago. So where's this bloat coming from?
There's a couple of things. One has definitely been vehicle safety. That's one of the motivations. There is no question that if you're surrounded by metal that's further away from your body, when you have a crash, you're less likely for it to come in contact with you if something crashes into you or you crash into something else. So there's definitely some safety considerations. There's the need to fit in more stuff like airbags, greater sort of structural integrity for safety. So all those kind of things have driven it a little bit. But I have to say, when we're talking about SUVs, I think that idea that bigger is safer has been accepted uncritically, and it's kind of got stuck in the public imagination. And I think there's other things happening there as well. If we're talking about things like your Dodge Ram or something, I mean, there is no way that you need to have a vehicle that is that large to create that level of safety that I've just been alluding to.
Yeah.
There's something else going on there. And so the question is, what else is going on there? I think it is partly a kind of elaboration or an exaggeration of this need for safety, but I think it's, or idea that big is better in terms of safety. But I think it's also the idea that people just really like being up high. They can see things.
Yeah.
You'll hear this anecdotally a lot if you start to talk to people about this. But of course, that then creates problems for people that are not up high. And then you kind of get people wanting to have a vehicle that's taller than the vehicles that are already on the road so that they can see over them. They don't get their view blocked.
Yeah.
I think that's the psychology of that is very easy to understand.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it?
You just want to, and then it becomes, well, it's been called an arms race in vehicle size because people just really want to constantly have the biggest, highest vehicle for that reason.
Okay.
But again, I think there's another thing that we need to think about as well, and I think there is very good evidence for this, and that is that vehicle manufacturers make more money out of bigger vehicles. The profit margin is bigger, and I think there's good evidence for that because I think there's some European data that shows that car sales have declined in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, but profits have increased. And that has coincided with the actual vehicles that are being purchased being more SUVs. So clearly there's something going on here. And if you look at advertising, there's a lot of emphasis on SUVs in vehicle advertising.
Yeah.
If you think about walking around Perth or driving around Perth, the billboards advertising vehicles, what are they advertising? When was the last time you saw one advertise a Corolla, for example?
No, they're all the big cars. And I'm interested in that. And there's a lot to unpack in terms of what the consumers are wanting from these vehicles. But it isn't one-sided, is it? There's manufacturers pushing these vehicles because as you say, you're now spending $100,000 on a ute.
Or more.
Or more.
Yes. In doing something else recently, I just looked up the purchase price of a Dodge Ram. I'm not picking on a Dodge Ram. It just happens to be a good example because there's a lot of them around in Perth now.
And they're cars you didn't see at all until quite
absolutely.
recently. Yes.
And they're way north of 100,000, I can tell you.
Okay. Well, we'll dig in a bit more into why people might be wanting to buy these. But you did touch on something before, which is the idea behind an SUV is, it's great for getting the kids' sport equipment around. And look, I have 2 SUVs, and you can put a kayak on them, you can put the kids' hockey sticks in the back, whatever you need to carry with you. But there's the promise of the holiday, there's the promise of the weekend away. So given that we've seen SUV sales go from sort of 45% to almost 60% of new car sales over the last sort of 5 years or so, which is quite an unusual shift, I would imagine, in that period of time, how much of this is an Australian phenomenon tied into this Australian lifestyle of, well, at any moment we might, head out bush?
It's definitely not an Australian phenomenon only. In fact, in the US, it's been an even more dramatic shift. I think the latest kind of figures are 80% of new vehicle sales are SUVs of some description, or your sort of dual cab ute type things.
Okay. 80%.
80%. So it's a very big change.
Is it similar factors there, the sense that you might go on your big road trip there? Or
surprisingly, I guess, there really hasn't been a lot of good research about what is going on here. I think it would be fascinating to do some research to find out what people are actually thinking. I talked to a guy when I did some radio who said that he bought his large American dual cab ute because he wanted to tow a very large caravan, and it was just more comfortable and safer. And I said, but what about driving around the city? And he said, oh, well, I've got an electric vehicle for that. So I think there is that sort of recognition that there is a use case for these vehicles, and there undoubtedly is a use case for these vehicles. If you want to tow a very large caravan, then it's going to be safer and more comfortable with one of these vehicles. I guess the question is, do we need to be seeing them driving around in the inner city areas? And that's where I think people have started to get a little bit started to question the value of that.
We'll come back to this. You touched on something there that hadn't really occurred to me, which is the idea of them being more comfortable and being more spacious. My first car was a little Nicky, and then I drove a Mini, and I'm reasonably tall, so I was used to being folded in as I needed to be. I now appreciate having a bit more legroom in an SUV. Is part of the rise of these larger cars the fact that we are getting bigger, not just taller, but we are perhaps larger than we were 20, 30 years ago?
Well, I don't think we're getting that much bigger. I mean,
there's no justification there.
There is clearly some concern about an increase in obesity in the Western world, but I'm not sure that, and we're definitely getting taller, there's no question, but I'm not sure we're getting taller by the amount that would
as rapidly as
justify
the
that
cars are
increase
expanding.
in vehicle size. But it's an interesting ergonomic question about what would have been the necessary increase in vehicle size to accommodate the physical changes across generations in people. And I don't know the answer to that, but that's a fascinating question.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear it. I suppose ergonomically, we are also more aware of this kind of chairs we actually enjoy sitting in. You look at the sort of chairs we sat in offices 20, 30 years ago, and they look fairly minimalist compared to the ones we sit in today. We can come back to that. You also touched before on the sort of car advertising that we see around the place, and obviously that has a major influence on people's buying behaviour and changing how we see vehicles. So we've talked about this a bit, but what sort of image, what's the promise of an SUV or a Truckzilla, one of those larger double cab utes we're seeing? What are they promising to give you when you add them to your lifestyle?
Well, I think it's exactly that idea that they can do everything that we were talking about. And that is true to some extent. They can do everything, but then the flip side of that is what economists would call the negative externalities. So what's the bad stuff that comes with these kind of vehicles? You know, that's the thing that we really need to think about. I mean, there's no free lunch, I'm afraid, here. There are negative externalities that have got people a little bit concerned about this trend.
Well, it'd be good to talk about that. But I guess part of the promise, and it's the same with any advertising promise really, is how much it's a mirage. The promise of all the great things you can do in this car, very few of us are actually using these vehicles for purpose, are we? We're mostly just doing the school run, as I said.
Absolutely. Nobody needs a high-riding four-wheel drive, highly capable four-wheel drive in an urban area. I mean, I live in an inner-city suburb, and there are Silverados, which are probably the biggest of all these vehicles that you can buy in Australia, and you can't even fit them in a car park. They literally will not fit in the car park. They will not fit in people's garages. They're parked on the verge because they will not fit in people's garages. I mean, there's something a little bit silly about that. I mean, the idea that these are multi-purpose vehicles that maybe a tradie would use, I don't think is. I'm happy to be corrected on this, but I see very few of them which are clearly work vehicles. And the fact is that the tray on these vehicles is of less capacity than a traditional tray-back ute.
Right.
So
is that right?
Yeah, they're really, it's not a massive amount of space. Or you could do what you need to do with a traditional tray-back ute. So they're clearly that's not the reason for them. I think, as you say, it's this idea that you can do everything, so that if you do have to go to Bunnings on the weekend, you can throw all the potting mix in the back without having to dirty your carpets. And the logic of that is difficult to argue with.
But beyond that, there's an element of status, which is inevitable when the cars are costing that much money to drive out of the dealership.
I think you're right, yes.
All right, well, maybe we can come back to that later. But you did touch on the fact that there's no free lunch, that the bigger the car, I suppose, the bigger the bill. So these vehicles are generally heavier and less efficient. So what is the trade-off between the size of the car and fuel use and emissions?
Well, I think it's ironic in a time that we're really worrying about global warming that we see the proliferation of these vehicles. I mean, that is truly ironic. And I think that the idea that there are actual tax incentives to purchase these vehicles is very difficult to understand.
Right.
And that has been the case, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware, that these vehicles have been exempt from the luxury car tax, for example.
Right.
It's, yeah.
Okay, so they're a status symbol that makes financial sense while those
It makes
incentives are
financial
in place.
sense and it makes practical sense,
Yeah.
but it clearly doesn't make environmental sense. And I mean, you could argue, okay, if you've got an electric version, then you're kind of exempt from that environmental criticism. But of course, that's not the case. We know that a significant degree of pollution comes from brake pad wear, tyre wear, those microparticles. And I'm not an expert in this, but people that are experts in this have modelled this. There is a significant concern about pollution from those, and a bigger, heavier vehicle, whether it's electric or whether it's an internal combustion engine vehicle, will create more of that pollution.
That's
so
interesting.
again,
Okay.
no free lunch again.
Because I've started to see the Build Your Dreams big Truckzilla super utes out there, but they still come at an environmental cost because of that wear and tear.
No question about it. And I mean, the embodied carbon to build something bigger is, of course, greater. So there's the environmental cost at that end of it as well, at the manufacturing end.
Okay. I mean, it is interesting because I've got some figures here that compare a 2022 Mazda 3 with a 2022 Ford Ranger Wildtrak four-wheel drive dual cab. So for fuel consumption, you see that for fuel use, the litres per kilometre is 6.2 litres for the Mazda and 10 litres. It's almost twice as much for the Ford Ranger. So over a year of travelling, you'd see a total of 14,000 kilometres, which is about the average for a vehicle in Australia. During that, the Mazda would produce 1.7 tonnes of CO2 emissions, which again is almost half of what the Ranger would produce at 3.1 tonnes. These are figures from the Australian government's Green Vehicle Guide. And of course, there's the financial cost to that. Over a year, the average fuel cost for the Mazda are going to be $1,603, but for the Ranger, it's $2,293. Do consumers need to be better informed about this impact on not just on the environment, but on their wallet before they shell out for one of these vehicles? Or do they know?
I doubt that they know because nobody's saying it, and they certainly don't know about something I can speak more confidently about, safety. They certainly don't know about the safety implications of these vehicles either, because again, that's not being talked about.
Well, let's talk more about safety, Paul. So, I mean, we touched on this at the start, that there's the sense that people buy these bigger cars because they are safer or they feel safer within them. Are they safer, and for whom are they safer?
All other things being equal, a vehicle of larger size and greater mass is definitely safer for the people that are in it, assuming a few things, up to a point. But of course, they're much less safe for other people on the road. And I think this is really where it becomes quite important to try and have some significant public education on this, because they're not just, it's not just that if a Ford Ranger crashes into a Toyota Corolla, that the Toyota Corolla is going to be worse off. It's the real concern that we have at the moment is the risk to vulnerable road users like pedestrians and cyclists with these vehicles. So there's really good research coming out now that shows that if you're a pedestrian or a cyclist and you get hit by one of these larger vehicles, that you have maybe a 50% greater chance of dying. And there's some research out of the US that suggests that if children are hit by one of these vehicles, they're 8 times more likely to be killed than if they're hit by a conventional sedan. So we're talking about something which is a lot more dangerous for vulnerable people in our community, that being children. And we normally try to prioritise the safety of children in our community. I mean, we already have an unfortunate situation where motor vehicle accidents are the biggest killer of children in Australia, between 1 and 14. And these kind of vehicles are adding to that existing risk. I mean, they haven't penetrated the market to the extent that they've penetrated the market in the US. But the enormous increase in pedestrian fatalities that they've seen in the US at least part of it has been attributed to the proliferation of these very large vehicles.
Well, we are seeing that impact here, aren't we? Because I know that road fatalities rose to a 12-year high last year, but it's at the same time you're seeing fatalities for drivers and passengers decreasing. So the pedestrian deaths have gone up by about 7%, cyclist deaths have gone up by almost 12%, motorcyclist deaths are going up. So it's happening, and I think we are innately aware of it. I know that it's one of the reasons I suspect that people don't like their kids out on the roads perhaps as much as they were when I was growing up, because cars are bigger. So we do know they're more dangerous, don't we?
Absolutely, and I think the advantage that people feel with these larger, taller vehicles, that they can see further ahead, they get that sense that it's actually safer because they can see what's going on, is not the case when it comes to children,
right?
Because you can't see children. Some of these vehicles are so tall that the child would have to be an extreme distance away before you can actually see over the bonnet and see the child. They have enormous blind spots for children.
I suppose if we're talking about blind spots, just having larger vehicles on the road is also creating more blind spots, isn't it? It's difficult to see around many of these cars.
Absolutely, and hence my comment before about an arms race with vehicles, because people, if they're in a small vehicle, at some point, when they're going to decide that I'm tired of not being able to see where I'm going. It's not a comfortable feeling being in a small car and not being able to see what's ahead of you, because you have no opportunity to anticipate.
No, I've been on both sides of that. I've been driving a Mini behind an old Porsche SUV and being aware they cannot see me. Yes. And likewise, I remember the first time I drove a four-wheel drive and a sports car pulled up beside. I did not see them coming. I could easily have pulled into them because they were totally...
Absolutely. And all the advanced driver assistance technology in the world is not going to be able to react quick enough to stop you, at least in some situations, avoiding that interaction.
Well, I did want to talk to you about that, because we are seeing a lot of safety features on cars now, like reverse cameras, sensors. But can they fully address the challenges that come with the size of the cars?
At this point in time, I think one thing that we do know is that there's a lack of standardization in these driver assistance systems, and there's a lot of variability in their sensitivity, for example. When people buy a new vehicle, they often have no idea how these features work. How many people sit down and read the car manual?
I have never read the manual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And figure this all out. It may well be that the car salesman doesn't even really know how it all works. I'm sure everybody knows people who have these advanced driver assistance systems in their vehicle, and they don't really know what they're doing or how they work. I'm not even convinced that a lot of people even know how really some of the older systems work, like emergency braking kind of systems, like anti-lock braking systems. I don't think people even understand that. Cars are a consumer item that people assume. It's like a toaster. They buy it and they use it, and they assume it will do what they want when they want. Yeah. And there's no understanding that it's a complex system, or it's a complex machine that's interacting with a complex system, which includes the road, other drivers, all sorts of things.
So we're putting a lot of trust in something we just don't understand, that we
Absolutely.
We don't know how it works.
The risks that come from these larger vehicles are only ever going to be mitigated by technology. If we allow them to exist, we need a technological solution to the problems that they create. And we also probably need to seriously think about some of the features of these vehicles. So, very good study out of the US recently, which showed that it's actually bonnet height, which is the really important thing.
Is that right? Why's that?
Because what happens with a very high, and you'll note that a lot of these vehicles now have not just very high bonnets, but very flat fronted bonnets. That's a styling issue. There is no reason they have to be like that. It's to make them look aggressive and macho.
Okay.
And we know that because the designers say that. That's what we're trying to do, and that's the market that we're selling to. But because they have that not only tall bonnet, but they have a very flat front, what happens when a pedestrian is struck is instead of, in a sedan, in a conventional sedan, what would with a low sloping bonnet is the pedestrian would get flipped up onto the bonnet. But with these vehicles, what happens is they basically just get knocked over like a 10-pin bowling pin and get run over.
Wow, okay.
So that is the thing that makes them particularly aggressive.
And that's just a style choice. It's not for speed
and it's a style
or for...
choice. There's no reason why these vehicles have to look like that. So there are definitely some vehicle design issues that could be addressed as well.
It's also true, I think, that many of those safety features we're talking about are, again, just to protect the driver and the passengers, to warn you that something's going to crash into you or to slam your brakes on because someone's pulled into the lane in front of you. But they're not safer for those vulnerable road users. I know there was a story I saw in The Guardian recently about a cyclist who was hit by a car because he didn't trigger the emergency beeping that the driver was used to whenever there was a car there.
Yes. And I mean, I think even if these things worked perfectly, pedestrian detection systems, for example, or cyclist detection systems, there's a question about what the driver does with that information. And there's also the question about what happens if they're driving a vehicle that they haven't driven before and they don't. There is this lack of standardisation, as I've said. I mean, these features are sold as or advertised as something that will make you want to buy the car, but they're not there. They're not actually. It doesn't come with any training,
right?
For example, I mean, I think that would be a very useful feature. If there was some kind of training about how to use these features.
It's true. All this new technology keeps coming in and we're still, no one sits you down to explain how it works. We just jump in and assume it will do what we need it to do. These vehicles, of course, also take up a large amount of space on the road. Is that a safety issue in itself, just the fact they are wider, longer, taking up more of the bitumen?
I'm not sure it's a safety issue in that sense. There has been some very interesting estimates about what effect they have on congestion, and in places where they are the majority of vehicles, I think the last estimate I saw was that they'd created a 10% increase in congestion just because of the extra road space that they take up.
Okay.
There are safety issues in the sense that you will see these vehicles, because they don't fit in conventional spaces, you will see them parked across footpaths, on cycleways, whether that's partly to do with the psychology of the people that own these vehicles. Mm-hmm. I guess we don't know that for sure, although we do know some things about driving very large vehicles. We know that it's difficult to judge your speed accurately. The higher that you are, it feels like you're going slower the higher that you sit.
That's interesting.
Eye height is correlated with speed. So if you say to people in a driving simulator, I want you to drive at 60 kilometres an hour, what you think is 60 kilometres an hour on this road, mm-hmm. And then you adjust their eye height artificially, they will drive faster the higher that they're seated. People will know that. I mean, if you're sitting in a low sports car, you would know this from your Mini example. It definitely feels like you're going faster the closer that you're sitting to the road.
Yeah,
and there
absolutely.
are good sort of the psychology of vision sort of explains why that's the case. There's no mystery to that. But that also suggests that you're more likely to accidentally speed in these kind of vehicles. And there's also evidence that because people feel safer, they engage in more risky behaviour as well. That's in those kind of vehicles.
That is interesting, isn't it? That the more the car makes us feel safe, perhaps the more dangerous we are to everyone else.
Yes, absolutely.
But I would like to talk about psychology in a moment. But before we move on from safety, is there an element to which these cars are not safer to drive? Are higher vehicles more likely to roll over, for example, compared to smaller cars?
Definitely more likely to roll over. I think the evidence is that electronic stability control is absolutely critical in these vehicles, and the evidence is probably that good electronic stability control can mitigate the rollover propensity of these vehicles. So you wouldn't want one without electronic stability control. Certainly older SUVs that was definitely a problem. I think it would be very hard to find a vehicle like that now that didn't have electronic stability control. Now, the question of whether they're all equally effective, we don't really know because we don't have that kind of data.
Okay. All right, so it has been an issue, but perhaps is less so now.
Yes.
Let's move on to psychology, because I am really interested in this. And you were talking about the way that people drive differently bigger cars just because they're higher up, and it seems that they're traveling more slowly. But is there also a psychology of size at play, that people feel bigger, they feel stronger? Is there perhaps a greater sense of entitlement or authority on the road?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think there's some fantastic opportunity for doing research in this area. From a pure road safety perspective, it doesn't really matter. We just want to make sure that people drive in a way that is appropriate for the conditions. But yes, I mean, I think there's a bit of work being done on this idea of motonormativity, which is this idea motonormativity, which is that we have created a world that is car-centric, or particularly our urban environments, which historically haven't been car-centric, have become car-centric, and we've built cities that are car-centric. And the whole idea of navigating around even very short distances by car by default has been burned into our brain. And people have called this motonormativity, and it gives rise to some very strange phenomena. You're talking about about psychology, but it means that people have this strange blind spot about cars. So, for example, there's research that shows that people think that people shouldn't stand outside schools smoking because it's bad for children.
Sure.
And obviously, passive smoking argument. We've won that argument in Australia. We've banned smoking in public places, restaurants. But then if you say to people, is it okay to sit in your diesel car outside of school with the engine running, people are much more likely to say that's okay.
Right.
It's okay to sit out there with pouring diesel fumes into the air, which we know that kind of particulate pollution is problematic, but not stand outside smoking a cigarette. So there is a definite blind spot when it comes to cars. And that's not the only thing. I mean, there's lots and lots of examples of this where people are much more prepared to tolerate the risk that accrues from cars than they are to tolerate an equivalent risk that comes from something else.
For example, they'll be happy to drive down to Cottesloe Beach, but they'll only swim within the shark net.
Exactly. Right. That would be a good example of it, okay. Despite the fact that the chance of being attacked by a shark is vanishingly small compared to the possibility of getting into a car accident. But we perceive the risk
of being much higher.
Yeah, absolutely.
Being much higher.
Absolutely.
Right. Going back to smaller car drivers, do they behave differently around larger vehicles? Are they more cautious, more likely to give way? Does it make them insecure?
I think there's a little, certainly anecdotal evidence and a little bit of other evidence that, in fact, yes, people are very uncomfortable, in small vehicles are very uncomfortable around these large vehicles, and obviously for very, very good reasons. And they are more cautious. And it may well be that extra caution is, if you like, kind of not artificially, but it's mitigating the risk from these vehicles to some extent, because the other drivers on the road are, if you like, doing the drivers of these large vehicles' job for them by getting out of the way.
By staying clear.
Yeah, by staying clear.
Okay.
I think people talk about that quite a bit. The other thing that people talk to me a lot about are the headlight heights at night. Because these vehicles are so high, if you're in a lower car, the headlights, instead of being aligned with the headlight height of your vehicle, they're literally through the windscreen into your face. So that kind of dazzle issue is not insignificant, and it's starting to show up. I think there's some data from the UK that that dazzle issue is starting to show up as a cause of nighttime crashes.
I'm sure most of us have had that experience of being temporarily blinded by someone's high beams or just the wrong height. You talked about the fact that our cities are designed for cars, that's their sort of natural environment now, I suppose. But how are these larger vehicles affecting the infrastructure? I suppose I'm thinking of wear and tear. You talked about the fact many of them are parked on verges because they can't squeeze into car space. I suspect almost all of us have attempted to park next to one of these in the outdated supermarket car park, perhaps. Are cities keeping pace with the demands of these large vehicles?
I think some cities are doing exactly what they should be doing. So, for example, Paris has, I think they've tripled the parking cost for vehicles over a certain weight. They're trying to discuss, obviously they've pedestrianised a whole lot of roads as well. So they've definitely gone down the path of trying to make cities pedestrian friendly and bicycle friendly, and try and get people out of their vehicles entirely, lowering speed limits. So yes, there's definitely and other European cities as well. In fact, even some US cities are talking about this, because these vehicles they don't work in city environments, and they certainly don't work in the kind of city environment that we should probably be aspiring to, given the environmental issues that we're faced with, and given the value of creating walkable, active transport, amenable cities. It's a no-brainer. People get very worked up about this idea that they won't be able to drive their car through a city, for example, but then they go on holiday to all these places that are super walkable, and that's where they go because they're nice places to be. But somehow they don't make that connection that their city could actually be like that if they just gave up the right to drive their cars in the way that they currently do.
So a really weird city. Kind of NIMBYism, not my backyard. I like livable cities, but just not where I'm living.
Well, it's exactly that motonormativity blind spot that I was talking about before. We understand this, the psychological phenomena we understand very well. Those kind of biases drive a lot of our behaviour, and it takes a lot to shift them. You have to kind of force it on people in a variety of ways. And again, I'll go back to the sort of passive smoking issue. People will remember the kerfuffle around banning smoking in public places and restaurants. It was going to kill pubs and restaurants. It was kind of the end of the world for retail.
That's right, yeah.
But it happened, and yeah, exactly. And it's a very similar kind of idea. And the arguments for restricting the access of these kind of vehicles in highly pedestrianised areas, and inner city areas generally, I guess, is exactly the same, because it's children that are going to suffer.
Well, what can we do if we're thinking about the children? What can we do to address this issue? A lot of the big utes, as you said before, the dual cab utes are eligible for tax incentives, even if they're mostly being used for private purposes. What's the solution? What policies do we need in place to discourage this supersizing trend?
The parking kind of issue is a really good one, I think. There's a lot of discussion about this at the moment. People are working on this. It's probably there are other people that would be better at suggesting the answer to this question, but I'll have a stab at it. And the way I think about it from a road safety perspective, and I am coming at this from a road safety perspective because that's my area of expertise, is that a large part of our driver's license that we pay, cover our vehicle license covers the cost of insurance if we injure someone. Now, these vehicles clearly are more risky. They're more likely to injure someone. So I think one way to deal with this would be to have a risk-based insurance system, so that if you want to drive something that's more risky to the community, then you have to actually put your hand in your pocket to do that. I think there's an ethical argument over and beyond that maybe you shouldn't be doing it anyway. Having said that, I think at the very least, you should be able to fund the cost of the health system that would have to bear that increased risk.
Well, there is obviously the funding health system, but it's also a nice way to signal that what you're doing is dangerous, that there is risk involved, even if it's not for you.
We didn't really, we sort of talked about that, about the fact that there's not a lot of communication around the risks associated with these vehicles in the way that we've been talking about it. And as you say, this would just need to be part of a suite of communication, I think, to get the community on board. I don't want to keep going back to the passive smoking issue. It's just that it's such a success story for Australia because it hasn't happened in a lot of other countries. But it took a lot of work over a long period of time. And now it's like a lot of these things. If you say to people, would you like people to start smoking in restaurants again? Pretty much nobody wants that to happen.
Yeah.
And the same thing will happen. We get this with speed limits as well. People don't want speed limits reduced often, not all the time, but often. But when they've been reduced and they've lived with it for some time, people don't want it to go back again. And we've seen this in other countries.
So it just needs that kind of the boldness. It needs some kind of public awareness campaign.
You've got to lead people or push people a little bit there. You've got to use a variety of means to get people there. Yeah. Sometimes it's more than a nudge. Sometimes it needs a really big push. But it's lots of things to get people to the point where because it's hard for people. It's easy for me as a road safety expert to go, this is obvious, because I know all this stuff. And even in the time that we've got today, I'm not sure I can communicate everything that's relevant here that would allow people to make a rational decision about this. But it's hard for people in the community who have got many other priorities and thinking about many other things, and it's not their job and it's not their business to expect them to get to the point where they can make that decision, that they will make the right decision. So we've got to give them that information and that support. And I don't think governments have been doing that. I think people that should have been doing this have dropped the ball on this. And I include myself in that. One of the reasons why I'm here is because I'm hoping that we can actually communicate some of these things in a way that gets people thinking about them.
Because you are competing, of course, with that promise that we talked about at the start of the marketing, of the dream that these cars are selling you.
But yes, exactly. There's no question that there is value to these vehicles from an individual perspective. The problem is that comes face to face or crashes headlong into, if you excuse the turn of phrase, the pun, crashes headlong into community benefit and safety. So this is not unprecedented. There are many things that are of personal benefit potentially to people, or there are personal freedom which are detrimental to society when everybody does it. So it's one of those, unfortunately, it's one of those kind of issues, I think, that we have to, as a community, decide that the community benefit is important enough that we need to think about what we do here.
In terms of, I suppose, policy changes, Australia's new vehicle efficiency standards set to roll out soon. Do you think that will have an impact on the size and the emissions profile of this larger vehicle fleet?
Oh, undoubtedly. But of course, as I've said before, that doesn't solve the road safety problem because we can have an electric vehicle which has all the same problems and some of the same pollution problems as well, as we talked about previously.
But an aspect of pollution that people really aren't conscious of or thinking about at all, I would have to say that had not occurred to me. I know there's the embodied carbon cost in an electric vehicle, but I hadn't thought about the particle pollution from the brake pads.
Yeah, I think it's something, again, this is not my area of expertise, but I think it's something that is a relatively recent kind of consideration that people have realised this is much more important than they previously thought.
You mentioned some overseas responses. Is there one that really stands out to you as the way forward, as a good way to tackle the supersizing of our cities' vehicles?
Just the Paris example, I think, and people will say, we're a very different place to Paris, and we are a very different place to Paris. I mean, there's no question about that. But what it shows, I think, is that you can do these things, and that people won't necessarily resist it indefinitely. I mean, when these kind of things were mooted, there was a lot of resistance. French people love their cars just as much as anybody else, and they want to be able to get in them and cut straight across Paris to go where they want to go. They can't do that anymore. And not only can they not do that, but if they go on the ring road, they have to which looks like a freeway, they have to travel at 50 kilometres an hour, which has had the surprising effect of not changing travel times hardly at all.
Is that right? Why not?
Because one of the things that causes congestion, as you will know, driving on the freeway, is the disparity in vehicle travel speed. So somebody brakes for something, then there's suddenly this big kind of shock wave, and that slows everything down. If you get everybody travelling at a much lower speed, it's much harder to get those speed differentials that create that shock wave. And so it actually often makes very little difference to journey time.
That's amazing.
So they've had great success with that, and reducing pollution as well, obviously. It's very hard to communicate these kind of things to people because they just don't believe it. But again, risk-based, I think that's what we should be doing with vehicles. We should be thinking about how we peg the cost of these vehicles, licensing costs, to the risk that is actually accrued from those vehicles.
I suppose in terms of that risk, in terms of the complex messaging that people get around these vehicles, as we've talked about the promise against the risk. If there was one thing that you would like to communicate to people who are thinking about buying one of these vehicles or are already driving one of these vehicles, what would be the key takeaway from our chat, do you think?
Oh, I think just the risk to children.
Right.
I just don't think that's understood at all. I think what people are thinking when they buy these vehicles, and a lot of them are family vehicles, you can see families in these vehicles. When people are buying these, they're thinking my child's going to be safer. But yes, but not if your child's playing in the street. It's that being able to take the perspective and not get stuck in this idea that everything is about being in a vehicle driving. Again, we're back to this motonormativity thing, that this idea that we do everything by all of our travel by being in a car, so everything's from the perspective of being in the car, is hugely problematic because it stops us seeing the risks in other ways.
It's interesting hearing you talk about that, and it comes back, I guess, to that the split between personal choice and what's good for the community. Because I know when we bought our SUV, we made sure it had a reverse camera because you'd heard these horror stories about people reversing over their own children. Obviously, we wanted our children to be safe, and people buy these SUVs because they want their children to be safe. There needs to be more thought given, perhaps, to everyone else's children. That's
absolutely.
What we're saying here.
Yes, absolutely.
For people considering their new car, they've been tempted by all the advertising they've seen around the Perth streets. What should they be thinking about beyond price, performance?
Well, I would definitely encourage people to think about safety, obviously, and to think about safety of vulnerable road users over and above just their safety in the vehicle. You can buy a vehicle that will keep your family safe, very safe, that is not going to have the same degree of risk for other people, pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists. Yeah, so you don't have to compromise your safety. You can have your cake and eat it too. What you can't have is the image that are associated with these vehicles.
And that's what it comes down to in the end, is the image.
I think that's it. I really think that's it. Barring sort of the use cases that we talked about very early on, which is, I'm a retired person. I want to travel around Australia towing a very large caravan. This is actually probably safer for me to do this. But we're not talking about situations where people are towing very large caravans around Australia. We're talking about these vehicles in urban areas, and that's the problem.
Professor Paul Roberts, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in. If you liked this episode, let us know and share it with a friend. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next episode of RAC's Horizons podcast.